In the highest, coldest reaches of Australia, there's a creature that, by every scientific account, shouldn't exist. For 70 years, it was known only from fossilised jawbone fragments, pulled from a limestone cave and dated to the last ice age. Extinct, a relic. A ghost of a world that vanished 20,000 years before Europeans ever set foot on this continent. Then, in 1966, someone found one alive. Not in a laboratory, not in an expedition tent, in the kitchen of a ski lodge, stealing bacon off a stove. That's only the beginning of what makes this place strange. The same frozen ground that kept this Ice Age survivor hidden for 7 decades is now doing something scientists did not expect. Something ancient, sealed away since before the first humans reached this land, is beginning to stir. Welcome to the Snowy Mountains, the coldest, and possibly the strangest, place in Australia. If you're new here, this is Geography, Science and Mystery, the channel that takes you to the most remote, dangerous, and misunderstood places on Earth, and separates the folklore from the facts. If that sounds like your kind of journey, subscribe now, because you won't want to miss where we're going next. To understand why this place produces so many strange headlines, you first need to understand what it actually is. The Snowy Mountains form the heart of the Australian Alps, a rugged spine of granite and ancient rock running through the southeastern corner of the continent, straddling New South Wales and Victoria. At their centre stands Mount Kosciuszko, 2,228 metres above sea, level the highest point on the Australian mainland. It doesn't look like much compared to the Himalayas or the Rockies. Worn down over hundreds of millions of years, its summit is a smooth, rolling dome rather than a jagged peak. But height was never what made this place dangerous. What makes it dangerous is what happened here during the last ice age. 20,000 years ago, glaciers carved this landscape, gouging out basins that filled with meltwater to form Australia's only glacial lakes, including the deep ice-blue waters of Blue Lake beneath the main range. When the glaciers retreated, they left behind vast fields of shattered granite boulders, frost fractured over millennia by a relentless cycle of freezing and thawing. Snow gums, twisted and stunted by wind, cling to the exposed slopes. Sphagnum bog spongy, waterlogged wetlands found almost nowhere else on the continent fill the high valleys, their peat soils quietly accumulating, undisturbed, for thousands of years. And then there's the cold itself. On the morning of June 29, 1994, the thermometer at Charlotte Pass, a village perched in the shadow of Kosciuszko, dropped to minus 23 degrees Celsius. It remains to this day the coldest temperature ever officially recorded in Australia, colder that morning than Australia's own research base in Antarctica. The weather station that recorded it was quietly decommissioned in 2015. Meaning that record may now stand indefinitely. But cold here has never been simply cold. It swings. Some winters bury these mountains under 2 metres of snow. Others, like the season unfolding as this video is being made, leave the same slopes nearly bare. It is a landscape built on extremes and on a fragile, ancient equilibrium that is not as stable as it once seemed. Long before any Europeans set eyes on these mountains, they were neither empty nor unknown. The Ngarigo people are recognised as the traditional custodians of this high country, and their connection to this landscape, along with neighbouring nations, stretches back more than 20,000 years older than the fossil record of the creature we mentioned a moment ago. But the Ngarigo did not live in these mountains year-round, and that choice was deliberate. Each summer, when the snow retreated and the days grew long, this landscape transformed into one of the largest meeting places in southeastern Australia. Millions of Bogong moths, migrating up from the lowlands, would gather in the cracks and crevices of the high granite boulder fields, packing themselves in by the thousands to wait out the heat below. Into these mountains came the people, not just the Ngarigo, but the Ngunnawal, the Yuin, the Walgalu, the Bidawal, the Gunai and others, travelling from country hundreds of kilometres away. Historical accounts describe gatherings of 500 to over 1,000 people at a time, drawn together not only to harvest the rich. Fatty moths roasted over coals, ground into cakes, ceremonially shared but to conduct trade, strengthen kinship ties across nations, and perform sacred initiation rites passed down through generations. It was diplomacy, economy, and ceremony, all built around one fleeting alpine season. And then, as the days shortened, they left. Every year, for thousands of generations, these nations withdrew to the lower valleys of the Monaro before the winter set in. This was not superstition. It was survival knowledge, refined over more time than written history can account for. The Ngarigo understood, long before any thermometer confirmed it, that these peaks became lethal once the cold descended, that the same granite that sheltered the moths in summer offered no mercy to a person caught out in a whiteout. Even brief exposure demanded protection. The Ngarigo crafted heavy cloaks from multiple possum pelts, sewn fur inward for warmth, simply to withstand short excursions into the alpine chill. In other words, the first and most accurate warning system this mountain range ever had wasn't a weather satellite. It was oral law, tested against the coldest ground in the country for over 20,000 years, and it said plainly, come in summer to feast and to gather and be gone long before the cold claims what it always has. The written record of this danger begins almost as soon as colonial settlers arrived. Gold rush prospectors who flooded into the goldfields at nearby Kiandra in the late 1850s and 1860s left records of storms that could kill within sight of shelter, of drifts burying huts to their roof lines. Decades later, when engineers began building the Snowy Mountains hydroelectric scheme in 1949, one of the most ambitious construction projects in the country's history, the mountains claimed workers with the same indifference. Avalanches, buried tunnels, and vehicles that vanished off icy roads contributed to an official toll of 121 deaths before the project's completion in 1974. But it is the more recent, more personal cases that keep drawing researchers back to these peaks. In August 1985, Stephen Crean, brother of future federal Labor leader Simon Crean, set out on a ski tour from Charlotte Pass as a blizzard closed in. He was never seen again. For 2 years, his disappearance remained a complete dead end until police received an anonymous package containing his wallet and identification. The trail led to a fruit picker who admitted he'd stumbled upon skeletal remains while hiking and had deliberately misled investigators about the location, intending to return later and take the rest. In 1999, 4 snowboarders sheltering from a sudden violent storm dug themselves into a snow cave on the main range. When searchers found them, the cave had not collapsed. There was no trace of carbon monoxide poisoning from the stove they'd used. And yet all 4 were dead, a case that unsettled even experienced alpine rescuers. In May 2013, 25-year-old Canadian hiker Prabhdeep Srawn parked his rental car at Charlotte Pass and walked into the mountains toward Mount Townsend. He was an experienced outdoorsman, an Army reservist. What followed was one of the largest search operations in Australian history: helicopters, thermal imaging, search dogs, volunteers from 3 countries. Not one item of his equipment was ever found. In 2015, a coroner formally ruled his presumed death, without a body, without a single trace. Then, in the summer of 2024 into 2025, the mountain offered a rare, startling exception. 23-year-old Hadi Nazari vanished near Blue Lake on Boxing Day 2024 for 13 days as 300 searchers combed the wilderness. His family prepared for the worst. He was found alive thin, dehydrated, but alive having survived on 2 muesli bars, foraged berries and creek water, having walked more than 10 kilometres through some of the most unforgiving terrain in the country. 4 cases, 40 years apart at their extremes, 3 tragedies and 1 miracle. every one of them unfolding across the same narrow ribbon of granite and snow below Australia's highest peak. If you're waiting for the supernatural explanation, some hidden vortex, some alien signal buried under the granite, keep watching. Because what researchers actually found beneath these mountains is stranger and far more consequential than any ghost story. Make sure you're subscribed, because we're about to get into it. With this many strange disappearances clustered in one place, it was probably inevitable that darker theories would take root. Online forums have speculated about a Kosciuszko triangle, drawing lazy comparisons to the Bermuda Triangle, and claiming the region sits atop some undiscovered magnetic anomaly capable of disabling compasses and phones. Others have pointed to scattered historical reports of unusual lights and aerial sightings across the region over the decades. Asking whether something is deliberately taking people from these peaks, investigators, meteorologists, and search and rescue veterans have heard every version of these theories, and they respond with evidence rather than speculation. The magnetic anomaly claims do not hold up against actual geological survey data of the range, which shows nothing beyond ordinary variation found across granite terrain worldwide. Those aerial sightings, on closer investigation, tend to correlate with known flight paths, weather balloons, and military exercises conducted across the broader region, not with anything more exotic. And the phone and GPS failures, which do occur here with unusual frequency, have a far more mundane explanation. This is some of the most severe terrain-blocked signal territory on the Australian mainland, where deep valleys and towering granite ridgelines routinely cut devices off from any tower or satellite. As for the disappearances themselves, search and rescue commanders who've worked this range for decades offer a blunter assessment. Kosciuszko National Park hosts 8,000 to 10,000 hikers on its most popular summer trail alone, and even a landscape this well-mapped will, statistically, occasionally swallow someone whole, not through any external force, but through sudden weather changes, disorienting whiteout conditions, and trackless terrain that can put a person a few hundred metres off trail and completely invisible too. Searchers passing close by. It's also worth being direct about one more thing. None of this diminishes, or should be confused with, the deep knowledge the Ngarigo and neighbouring nations held about this landscape. Their seasonal avoidance of the high country was not folklore or superstition dressed up as caution it was tested. Empirical survival knowledge, refined over hundreds of generations. If anything, it was more rigorous than anything modern instrumentation offered until the 20th century. In other words, no vortex, no signal, no hidden hand, just a mountain range that is far more dangerous and far less forgiving than its modest height would ever suggest to someone standing at the trailhead on a clear summer morning. So what is actually happening in this landscape? Two separate, very real processes, one immediate and physical, one slow and geological. The immediate danger is simpler than any theory: exposure. On the exposed granite plateau around Kosciuszko, weather can shift from clear skies to zero visibility whiteout in under 20 minutes, with wind chill dropping perceived temperatures far below whatever the thermometer reads. Hypothermia, in its final stages, can trigger paradoxical undressing, a genuine, well-documented phenomenon in which victims, disoriented by circulatory failure, tear off their own clothing in their final minutes. Which is one reason searchers sometimes find scattered gear far from where a person was last seen evidence some have mistaken for signs of a struggle. Add granite boulder fields riddled with hidden voids deep enough to swallow a person and their pack from view, and you have more than enough to explain every disappearance on this mountain without inventing anything supernatural. But the slower danger is the one that actually connects to a prehistoric threat. Beneath the surface. This landscape's sphagnum peat bogs have spent thousands of years locking carbon away, layer by patient layer, in cold, waterlogged soil undisturbed since the Ice Age. Recent research shows the very wind and rainfall patterns that allowed these bogs to form, patterns that have held relatively steady for over 10,000 years, are now shifting again, and scientists studying similar ancient peatlands elsewhere have already documented them flipping from carbon sinks into carbon sources, drying, cracking, and releasing their long-buried stores back into the atmosphere. At the same time, the one confirmed living Ice Age relic in these mountains, the mountain pygmy possum, survives only by hibernating beneath a thick, reliable blanket of winter snow. As this landscape swings harder between record cold and record warmth, that blanket is becoming less and less reliable. The ancient world sealed into this ground for 20,000 years is not sending out a virus or a monster. It's simply, quietly coming undone, and that, it turns out, is exactly the kind of danger the Ngarigo always warned this mountain could hold. In the end, the story of these mountains isn't really about monsters, ancient or otherwise. It's about how this landscape holds two kinds of truth at once. The caution of scientists reading 10,000-year-old peat cores, and the caution of a people who learned the same lesson by simply staying alive here for 20,000 years. Science didn't discover that this place is dangerous. It just finally caught up with what the Ngarigo always knew. Would you hike the main range in winter, knowing what you know now? Tell us in the comments and subscribe, because another mystery is waiting next week.